Hey, hello, happy holidays. Welcome to another episode of Wing Zero Symphonics. And on this episode, I want to make sure things are taken very slowly. In that today I was practicing martial arts, and upon reflection, it dawned on me that my flexibility is something that can be contained. It can be learned to be contained so that effectiveness and stability can permeate, and the obvious advantages of flexibility can more readily make their way into my routine. And so, with that being said, I have no particular topic for today, but what had crossed my mind was, what if Marlon Brando was here for the holidays? Right? What if Marlon Brando was here for the holidays? The way that I had pictured that for myself was asking the question, what if Big Boss was here for the holidays? And when I was looking to make a video about using Big Boss as the pseudonym for describing as to why exactly it would be interesting for Big Boss or this character to be here for the holidays. But like the previous video I was going to make, which was one that was about the serious dialogue that oneself and each other have to have about the nature of self-destruction, but also about the kind of relaxation that is required in order to make it a day-to-day freedom from such a harrowing consequence. And so that video was scrapped because, although flexible and relaxed, the serious element was missing to a degree that I found was not suitable to present. So, and as well as one of the difficulties in daily living are expectations. And so I had to ask myself seriously, do I believe that audiences would get or pick up on some of the notions that I was bringing forth? And seriously, no. That if I had to ask myself seriously, does that usually prompt me to not exhibit something or describe something or look into something in such a manner where the audience expectations are, let's say, up in the air? Usually. So, for this episode, looking into why it is that I'd find it interesting to spend the holidays with Marlon Brando is related to such questions. So, for example, Marlon Brando, in one of his films that he had shot in his 40s, showed his flexibility in one scene, in a few scenes maybe. One scene in particular showed just how flexible he was. And spruce, he was very sprucey for his age. And it's a detail that I won't forget. Because sometimes I try to think to myself or figure what it is that was compelling Marlon to give in to a certain self-destructive behavior near the ending of his life, which at the same time, upon seeing the very few interviews that Marlon gave, a man who was almost joyful like the Buddha. So to suggest one way or the other is difficult. It's a difficult call. So, without judgment, then, looking into the life of Marlon Brando. And essentially, many people do. Far less now because of such great amount of time that has passed, but certainly Generation X actors and baby boomer actors may fondly reminisce on Marlon Brando. And if we look closely, if we listen closely to what many of these Hollywood performers who may have met Marlon Brando or were in the vicinity in the same industry as Marlon Brando, often tell tales of absurdity, tales of which themselves may not hold much meaning or value, but are maybe funny, and certainly unorthodox, and the like. But those stories do not interest me. I'm not interested in hearing what it is that Marlon, knowing how word spreads, essentially would play the game of telephone, and eventually it gets to some, in Marlon's view, a perhaps bloated, a perhaps star-driven, celebrity-driven sort of facet of the entertainment industry. And so what would interest me to speak with Marlon about would be, often as he would practice small talk. Not only in the dialogue of his films, sometimes small talk he felt was more appropriate for a scene than otherwise, or in interviews. Oftentimes in interviews, there would be this wanting to know, and a wanting to know of which is absent on my part. And that's why when I see Marlon sort of interject or change the subject or talk about the dog, that this has been a lifelong sort of journey and difficulty for him. I'm sure it was frustrating. See, Marlon, there's one picture of Marlon on the set of some movie in the 50s. He was very young, he was very muscular, and look, he was playing some sort of silly character, okay? And he was reading a book by Jiddu Krishnamurti. And Jiddu Krishnamurti at that time, Jiddu Krishnamurti had evolved just like Marlon did. And so, me having gone very deeply for myself with the work of Krishnamurti, I can imagine Marlon in the picture with the book, looking at the camera, smiling, and realizing that no one in this town, or in this industry, or in this business, that's not something that is of sincere interest. The pace is too quick. The potential for stardom, for riches, is too vast. And he himself had come upon something that would evolutionize him, but at the same time, that degree of seriousness of which Krishnamurti would come forth with is difficult for any one human being, certainly. So, and imagine the peer pressure of an industry where everyone is thinking the same, looking the same, acting the same, okay, after the same thing. It gets difficult to say, well, maybe I'm a bit too serious about this. And so perhaps what could alleviate that frustration is a creative display, a creative project, a work. One which is creative in that it's a play, it's a film production or a movie, right, to entertain. But the canvas, the art, allows for a degree of any sort of emotion, perspective, that an artist would like to draw upon. And so the 50s marked a sort of playing a role, the Hollywood tough guy kind of thing. And then the 60s saw Marlon get very involved in civil rights. Right? So this is the civil rights era. And Marlon was not too keen on being an entertainer in a world where injustice was in the movie theaters themselves. So it didn't make sense to him to play around while, you know, civil society in America has something serious that it needs to attend to. So the 60s saw Marlon do many films. Certainly he was a relevant actor at the time, but a lot of them were pretty funny movies. I mean, silly movies. And some of them were serious. I'd say if we look into the late 60s, we find Reflections in a Golden Eye. And the movie was one that was a psychological sort of thriller. And it really challenged the audiences to figure what is this character, Marlon's character. What is this interplay that's taking place with some of these characters? It's very unusual. And it's a military drama. It takes place on a military base, including military officers. That's the premise. And it was a movie that I've seen often, but it's still not the degree of seriousness that I think Marlon was really looking to demonstrate. So by the early 70s, Marlon came upon two projects. One was Mario Puzo's The Godfather, the novel, adapted to film by a quite new Hollywood groundbreaking director. He was young at the time, but now we know him as Francis Ford Coppola. And Marlon wasn't sure if he could do the part, but he certainly did. And that degree of seriousness that we see in The Godfather is one that the premise of the movie perhaps is not what Marlon is aiming to be serious about, but it was one which demonstrated perhaps what kind of a degree of seriousness is effective in The Godfather, in the movie The Godfather, okay? And to imagine a character as such, which really delved on the line of violence and justice, solving for injustice while being unjust in his ways. And so that is an interesting dynamic that Marlon really got across. And the films in general got across. Many actors were able to really put the audience in a position to ask for themselves. And then, just before that, Marlon had done a film called Last Tango in Paris. And it really drove a very hard bargain. A real mixture in between a sort of love affair gone wrong, maybe a more of a symbolic tale, and maybe more of just a candid look into what inner conflict this character, this human being, may face. So those two productions were quite impressive. I would watch The Godfather many times. The Last Tango in Paris I've watched many times as well. And then we turned into the mid-70s with Apocalypse Now. Marlon only appears at the end of this film. And his involvement with the production was another one of those stories that most people are interested in. But I can see how difficult it is for Marlon to really ask that level of seriousness out of this production. Require it, demand it. For what purpose? Not for the purposes that most people could see for themselves, but trusting him with it. And at that time, he was a figure who demonstrated that if you let him be him, you're going to get something special. And so we sure did get something special. Special enough to when I play a video game called Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Some of the dynamics, once again, of a leader or a character set in between violence and peace, justice and injustice, knowledge, memory, and experience, and its conditional value, you see. To break it down like that simply is a very difficult thing to do, to draw that essence down. And certainly Marlon wanted to make films that afterwards that were a little more serious perhaps on the issue of apartheid in in South Africa. And in one of his rare interviews, he went on to describe his frustration with Hollywood producers who were not interested in telling the whole story about the injustice in South Africa. Why? Because it's an entertainment industry. So, would I want to pick Marlon's mind as to how, what, when, or why? Or is it enough to have picked up for myself these seemingly unexplainable manners of communicating across something? It was such an interest to Marlon. And instead understand that ultimately what is trying to be communicated cannot be communicated through words. Can it be communicated then through a medium such as acting or film, of which the audience figures for themselves, decides for themselves? And whether coming upon such a quality which can't be described in words, whether that's enough, and that will have an effect on one's life, in relation to others, in relation to the world, to the point where holidays with Marlon would be maybe doing some yoga, maybe we'll do some martial arts, something like that. We'll have some to eat, some burgers, I don't know. We'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about sports. We'll talk about supplements. We'll talk about food. We'll talk about dogs.